Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you at the panel session devoted to artificial intelligence and drug discovery process. My name is Magdalena Kulczycka, and I'm a representative of Central European BioForum Congress. I would like to introduce our panelists, Dr. Richard Fox. Hi, Richard. Who's a CSO and co-founder of companies Delta Scientific and Evolve. Dr. Fox has a broad international experience in application of AI in drug discovery processes. The second panelist is Dr. Stanisław Jastrzębski, who's a CSO of Molecule.one, a Polish startup company, and dealing with application of artificial intelligence in chemical synthesis. He's also an active scientist as an assistant professor at Jagiellonian University in Krakow. And I also would like to welcome Chris Parjaszewski, CEO of SkyGate and SkyHealth companies, that are involved in data science and life science projects with big pharma companies. System. Moreover, when we, I don't know if you're aware, but also street light systems, for example in Wrocław, are also being controlled by artificial intelligence. Here we would like to concentrate more on application of those technologies, such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, in such a process as drug discovery, and how these innovations can be beneficial to all of us. First question I would like to address to Richard. Could you share your experience and your knowledge how AI is being applied in a drug discovery pipeline, which is very, very long? So how does it help us?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And we use artificial intelligence and machine learning to manage these large data sets of how proteins form using the guidelines or constraints of evolution. And we understand from being able to analyze large sets of data the patterns of how proteins form. So for example, if we think of concepts of evolution, and we go to Sweden and we look at somebody who's got blonde hair, the probability of that individual having blue eyes is very high. So genetics and evolution do not occur in a vacuum. They are constrained by the reality of what can happen versus what could happen. And we use these same principles to guide how we form proteins using computer and data science. And what this allows us to do is create variants of molecules that are evolutionarily likely to happen, and we can test them for biological function. And what this allows us to do is reduce and constrain the development time. So if we think of a normal drug discovery pipeline taking 5 or 6 years to get to in vivo proof of concept data, what we've been able to demonstrate by using this computational approach is that we can design antibodies from scratch. We call this ab initio design, so we don't need an antigen. And we can demonstrate that this molecule has the physiological characteristics that we're interested in from a drug-like perspective, and test that molecule in the laboratory and demonstrate that we can do this better than traditional approaches such as phage display, for example, or hybridoma. And this is because we can create these data sets that are so much larger and complex than what nature can actually do. And then we can use the mathematics to screen down and compartmentalize those that are valuable versus those that are less valuable. So from our perspective, we intend to shorten or truncate the development pipeline from a 5-year to in vivo proof of concept to less than 12 months. And we've been able to demonstrate this with our collaborators already, as we have packages that are moving towards proof of concept and first in human testing. Thank you.
That's absolutely amazing. This shortenage of time, it's wonderful. Chris, do you have similar experience, and could you comment on it?
Sure. So I would comment that I will start with the recent 2 years has shown how quickly we as humanity can solve complex problems such as new virus being such in a so fast manner spreading out through the world, and then how we can solve it. I think there has been a brilliant proof of concept of how working together and sharing various data sets, how that can end up bringing up new treatments, new vaccines, new approaches. Oftentimes that has been a reuse of already known methods in healthcare and medicine, but targeted for the new challenge that we have. I was reading an article this morning about the UK Parliament voting for more research in aging as a root cause for many other diseases that we are tackling these days, like cancer, like neuro damage diseases, like cardiac diseases. But the very root cause of that is aging, and there has been already proof of concepts where we can reuse already approved medicines in the new ways with higher dose or lower dose, but reusing them, targeting, fighting and tackling aging hallmarks, which, by the way, is my inspiration to switch from living in a very interesting data science world and entering towards life science, because I believe this is our most important problem to solve in this century, to really understand the reasons for all diseases. And I do believe that one of the root cause here is understanding the aging process and how we can slow down, eventually how we can stop it from happening or even reversing. And there have been some interesting proof of concept on that. To your question on the pipeline, I would echo what Richard said, and what I would add to that is that drug discovery in general, from mathematical perspective, this is a very complex process with many stakeholders involved, from chemical mathematics, protein simulations in silico, versus hospitals and FDA regulatory that are approving certain drugs to happen. So from the data science perspective, what is really important that we share data sets throughout these various bodies and organizations, and hopefully then new drugs can come quicker to the market to help humans suffer less and get sick less. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, yes, I think that all of us can confirm that this we need to speed up the drug development processes, especially what you mentioned, this mutation of viruses, for example, or bacteria. That's a big challenge, right? To speed up our discoveries versus the speed of nature and natural processes, right? But this is what you touched on is actually this broader view, broader perspective, right? And I would like to ask Stanisław, Dr. Jastrzębski, how in practical you are like, how this artificial intelligence in practice, how does it really function? And could you give us any example?
First, I wanted to offer a bit contrarian perspective on what was just said. So I think it's useful to also mention that while artificial intelligence is making strides in our lives and is making as well strides in drug discovery, it's still to make a big impact on the drug discovery field. I think this is well exemplified by the coronavirus pandemic, where still artificial intelligence techniques have not proven yet very practical. And I wanted to say it also to emphasize what Chris said, that dataset sharing, I think, is the way forward, or is a very important aspect of making artificial intelligence truly practical. It also serves as a good start to answer your question. So artificial intelligence techniques at its core, or these that we are using every day, they fundamentally rely on large data sets of examples. So the way these methods are developed, at least right now, is that we have algorithms that, after being fed with large numbers of examples, are able to replicate the behavior that they were fed with, and this crucially relies on large data sets. So, for example, one of very practical breakthroughs in artificial intelligence is now accessible as, well, automatic translation methods, and it was enabled by access to almost infinite amount of data that is available, well, on the internet, for example. So I hope this gives some perspective.
Well, this is interesting. That you mentioned that artificial intelligence didn't help us much in the drug discovery.
It's a contrarian perspective.
Yes, yes. Could you comment on it? Like, because this is quite interesting. Mm-hmm. Why? Because there was a lot of hustle in mass media that all of us are cooperating in order to speed up the discovery of anti-COVID vaccines, right? Means, for example, data sharing, right? Why they didn't?
So I was specifically commenting on artificial intelligence. The speed with which we have developed vaccines and the way the scientific community has worked together is remarkable. I was specifically talking about artificial intelligence. In terms of other technologies, data science as well as medical technologies, I think that was definitely a success how quickly we came up with vaccines. So just to make it a bit more precise what I meant.
All right.
In terms of what is the reason that artificial intelligence has not yet proven valuable, and is that biology is complicated, at least that's my view. And one of the key roadblocks in my view, again, this is only personal opinion, is to understand biology. And then another perspective is that I am extremely optimistic about how the artificial intelligence will impact the field. But for that, I think we need to, I think this will come, we'll need a bit more time on developing large data sets and better methods and coming together as the whole drug discovery field in applying this method. So it's still I'm extremely optimistic, just to make it clear. I would just say that we still have to prove our value to really speeding up the drug discovery pipeline.
Yes, I totally agree with this translational problems, right, of the results that we obtain, to how to translate them into the real biological systems. And yes, so this it's not only about science and having results, but this translation as well and practical use. So continuing on this topic, could you, Chris, maybe you could come up with like real life examples where artificial intelligence is already helping us to improve our health.
So, from the Polish market, there is a startup based in Tricity, led by a co-founder of Ivona. Ivona is a speech bot that actually has been sold to Amazon, and now he's working on a AI in healthcare startup that actually understands our basic habits like eating, sleeping, practice, exercise, etc., and is giving you points, rewards, like you have done a very good breakfast in the morning, 3 points, and actually these aren't points, they are explaining that you just gave yourself 3 extra days in your life. So this is really interesting, and I will say that I've met 3 interesting teams when I was in Tricity this summer. One is this team that's building this app for building and training healthy habits in life. One team was working with agriculture, trying to understand why pigs and cows are getting sick in general through cameras, through some sensors, and very interesting project on that. And the last one was a team led by Anna Supernat with the Gdańsk Medical University, using computer vision in order to prognose and diagnose from blood if a certain patient is having a cancer. It was a women-specific cancer. So they had data from the medical university because they do have access to clinics, and they also are working very closely with data science teams that are very strong in computer vision and understanding, building models, training models by classifying images, and the current efficiency in classifying this is 76% or something like that. So it's really amazing that you can just have a blood test and diagnose for certain cancers. So that are just like small segments, because in general, like biology, as Stanisław said, is a very, very complex, and I do believe that eventually we might need some even quantum computers to really simulate and understand what's going on. However, in data science, what is really important, and sometimes it's very frustrating for data scientists and people that really want to work with machine learning models, is that 90% of the work is cleaning your data sets and building standards and really like gathering data, because there is not so much. So that really takes 90% of the work, and sometimes even visualizing your data set, trying to see certain how data is segmented, if it is well balanced. That's really part of the process before you really can apply certain models, because otherwise you just get very wrong response and answer, so the model doesn't make sense. So I do agree with Stanisław that it's not, the goal is not to, I would say it's a reward to be able to use some models, but actually what is really need to be done as a first step is to have large and meaningful data sets, be able to use them and understand what they possess and consist. So that's really a very, very long process before you actually can apply certain models.
Richard, could you comment on it according to your experience? Do you know what are the ways used abroad and globally in order to unify those data sets? Because according to what Chris said.
Yeah, I would agree with what Chris said wholeheartedly, and this is a significant problem. So there's kind of 2 ways of thinking about this. People who are computer scientists, and you've got your biologists who understand that we're just scratching the surface of the complexity of what biology really is. So when I talk to the people on the tech team and they say things like, well, we're sitting on 3 billion unique data points and it's a really large data set, Richard. And I say, well, how many people are on the planet? And how many genes does each individual have? And what is the complexity of the shuffling of these genes? So now we've got roughly 30,000 genes, and we'll call it 8 billion people. Where are we with our 3 billion data points relative to this inflection? So the goal is, how do you bring the scale of software economics to healthcare? And the way that you can do that is you have to come with a standardization of these broad types of data sets across the mass of people. So when we look in the field of small molecules, where Stanisław is, there's actually a conventional naming system for how these small molecules are named. But when we look at human biology and we say, we call protein X because it interacts with something else that we know. There is no systematic nomenclature for how we organize things. And there's a push to create some of these, but there's also a financial cost. And there's proprietary data that companies like we sit on versus another company. And how we share that data comes with an economic cost, right? So the motivation needs to be, how do we overcome these limitations of economics and financial incentive in order to create an even playing field where everybody has access to the data that can be curated in a meaningful way, that we can all go in and start to sample that data to create cures and move things faster, right? That's kind of step one. Step two is that there's not enough labs on the planet for us to be able to test these hypotheses, right? So we could theoretically take the what we call the druggable proteome, and there's maybe 350 targets that are exposed on the cell surface that could be useful. In order to create antibodies and test antibodies in functional systems across 300 plus targets is a Herculean effort, right? You look at a drug company like Merck, and they might look at, say, 3 or 4 antibodies in a year. So how many big pharmaceutical companies do we have to have investing that type of resource in order to look at these at the physiological level in the lab? Or do we create a robust data set that allows us to go in and sample and pick them out, right? Because right now the approach is, we're looking for a key to a lock, and we're using the lock to fish out a key. That's immunization. That's how the immune system builds an antibody. And with the larger data set, with the right data, we can use a key and say, can you give me better keys that open that lock? Right? So that's the economy of scale of what the software can do, but translating that into meaningful data that advances science that we can put into the patient in a safe and efficacious way is the obstacle. And I hope that my colleagues on the panel would agree. Thank you.
Well, but do you think that the solution for this sharing, the economics of sharing data, would be the open source of data? Richard?
Yeah, I mean, I believe that it has to be open source, and there has to be also constraints of how this data is used, right? Because we're talking about sensitive information about people. So how do you anonymize all of this publicly available open access data, right? Because if we're looking at things in isolation and we say, here's some immune repertoire from patient A before bone marrow transplantation and after bone marrow transplantation. Mm-hmm. It's a snapshot of what occurred at 2 different times. where the meaningful data comes from is being able to look at that longitudinal sets of data that can allow you to reconstruct how that disease process initiated and how it went from being a single cell that became misprogrammed to 15 years later, it's a tumor in the brain that killed the patient. But unpacking that data and doing it in a way that is not harmful to the patient is a significant ethical challenge, and something that we on the data science and the science side really don't discuss enough, is the ethics of the work that we're doing and how do we protect
Yes.
people whom we're trying to create beneficial cures for. So it's a complex problem, but really the only way to solve it is that we have to make it open source. And in order to make it open source, there needs to be an economic benefit, and the economic benefit is going to be the creation of cures.
Yes, actually, thank you on touching on the economic benefit, because this was one of my following questions, like that might be a bit controversial. Where's the money in using the AI and machine learning and drug discovery process? Because I know we are all very idealistic here, and we like innovations and progress, but at the end of the day, there's always economics behind that. Comment on it? I don't know.
So I would start with a number that typically, in order to bring one drug to the market, it takes like 2 billion euro on average, because especially it is super expensive. Also, when you have failed clinical trials, what it means for the experiment, it means that, oh well, you know, experiment failed, we need to try again, but actually somebody get healthier to get out from his disease. Actually, for him, it means very bad news. So what we need is actually lower down the cost for bringing new drug. And I've recently talked to a friend of mine. She works in life science in London, and she told that large big pharma companies are no longer interested in generally like solving and building antibiotics, like for viruses, for bacteria, because it doesn't bring them an economical encouragement, because it's too expensive and then it doesn't pay off. So from one hand, you can say, well, they focus on cancer and other more lucrative drugs, but for us it means people will die because it just doesn't make economical sense. So I feel at this stage the regulatory bodies should work closely to private organizations in order to really understand that at the end of the day what we are solving here is not some, I don't know, building better cars or even making, I don't know, banking system more efficient. We're talking about people dying here. Like, so this is real problem for us. And you can say that one person can pay this and that amount of taxes, but how we can even evaluate a person as a unit? So I believe there is a lot of money actually being wasted because the clinical trials shouldn't even be started. So there's too much guessing. And if we can make the in vivo and in silico process that are really giving us, I know, 99 accuracy assurance that actually what we are bringing to the clinical trials is really going to work, that's where I believe the money lies. And we should work together on making this clinical trial more and more successful and less failed. However, there is so much data in the failed clinical trials that actually can be reused in order for the new candidates to be better. So maybe there can be some economical incentives for the big pharma companies to actually sell or license We've been on a discussion for the Polish hub Gaia X yesterday, and Gaia X is the European project built on top of blockchain technology, where it works for the banking system, works for automotive companies. So maybe there is a way where big pharma companies can, say, open source these data points they do have. However, whenever money is being generated out of that, these companies should be paid back, because they actually put hundreds of millions of dollars to bring this data. So it's really, they deserve a payback. So I believe, surprisingly, maybe the solution is somewhere around blockchain technology. For me, it's a surprise, because I privately doubt there is any business use case, but actually this can be one of the very important use case for sharing data and sharing the benefits for that. So Gaia X, for me, is a very interesting concept, very interesting model, and probably it can be a framework for big pharma working closely with regulatory and public sector.
Yes, this is a very promising project, in fact. Richard, can you also give us some examples from economical point of view of benefits of applying artificial intelligence in the drug discovery process?
Yeah. So when we look at the early discovery, on average, it costs about $50 million in 5 years to just bring an asset to proof of concept in vivo studies. That's the first time that you put a drug into a mouse. A lot of that development cost is people, human resources, failed experiments, reagents, space, time. So if we reduce that from 60 months to 12 months by using the power of artificial intelligence, and people often think of it as, machine doing, but it's not machine doing, it's machine learning. So these data sets that we're talking about that get brought in are what can be used to feed the system and accelerate the pipeline, right? So when we look at developing antibodies on a 12-month horizon, from conceptual framework to in vivo proof of concept, we incorporate roughly 400 in silico assays that represent what we would do scientifically in the lab. So we measure biophysical or physiochemical properties of an asset. Is it thermally stable? Does it have the potential for post-translational modifications? Blah, blah, blah. All these things that make a molecule not a drug, right? And a lot of times people say, well, we're looking for binders, right? A binder is an antibody that sticks to something. We're not interested in finding binders. We're interested in finding drugs that bind. So we can use these data to do it at scale, to reduce the cost, so that we can translate that cost to our collaborators and partners, right? So the economy of software can be translated to the healthcare economics, because if we can do a program for $5 million instead of $50 million, and we can then take the data sets that say, what's the probability of this being successful in phase 1, and triage programs based on artificial intelligently or smartly selected criteria that say, these particular patients are the best patients for this particular cure, right? Because molecule A may work better in a certain subpopulation of patients than molecule B, right? Especially in the biologic space, because there's differences on how my immune system, Chris's immune system, Stanisław's immune system are going to respond to the biologic drug that I'm putting into. So if we collect these information and say, how does the immune system function? And is drug A going to work in patient A? And can we use this to guide phase 1 decision making? And then as we get more and more data, can we use this to guide phase 2 decision making, phase 3 decision making? In 4 or 5 years, maybe 10 years, we may be able to do clinical trials on 10 people and the rest are digital twins. Right? So we create these avatars of humans in the computer because we'll have the data that says what's the probability of this type of interaction and chain of events that are going to occur. Are we going to induce cytokine release syndrome? Are we going to kill the patient? Which is a bad outcome, right? But if we can limit that exposure, if we can reduce the scale and we can truncate the time, then we can bring assets to people that are going to be beneficial. But we need to sit on the right data that's smartly selected, well curated, and intended for the proper utilization so that the machine can learn as opposed to the machine will do.
That's why what you're saying is actually proving how important is this data sharing, right? And the consolidation of the data. Because otherwise you don't have all those informations required to make, for example, those avatars, right? And to perform all the analysis. Very interesting. And Stanisław, do your customers benefit economically on the projects or the results that you deliver to them?
Well, that's certainly our hope. I can describe briefly what we do. I think it's an interesting aspect of the drug discovery process. So we are in the early stage that Richard was addressing. And fundamentally what we are doing there, or what the early stage is about, is looking through a large number of molecules to see which one of them are, as Richard was saying, binders that are drugs. And what we are doing at Molecule.one, we are supporting this part where you have to make them physically. It's one thing to represent molecules in computer and draw them. It's another thing to synthesize them. And one of the reasons, one of many that the drug discovery process is slow, is that making molecules is actually a difficult endeavor. So that's how we are trying to deliver economic value, by making it easier for chemists or for people involved in the drug discovery process to realize their visions. So they ideally are not constrained by what can be made, but rather they can explore all options that are interesting. And maybe one interesting perspective on drug discovery process is how it interacts with organic chemistry. So in particular, advances in organic chemistry, which is a very fast evolving scientific field, have often then trickled down to drug discovery because they enable looking through novel spaces of molecules. So that's how we deliver or try to deliver value. I also wanted to touch upon the data sharing that was brought. So I think it's interesting because there is an interesting question for what the government might do about this. So one model is what Richard was saying, open sourcing data sets. Another is doing this through some sort of blockchain technologies. And I think this is fundamentally important, and perhaps it is a place where government has to do some work. One perspective is that many companies have huge amounts of data that they are not using. It's not only in drug discovery. For example, in automatic diagnosis, hospitals have large number of let's say, scans of patients for breast cancer. Millions of scans are just lying on disks, siloed in hospitals. And it's interesting to think what would happen if we had all of these data sets aggregated together and having trained one model of them on them. Maybe that would be orders of magnitude more powerful. But it is somewhat, it doesn't happen because there are no clear economic incentives to share data sets between hospitals. So I think that's an interesting problem to solve.
Thank you on touching on that, because this was actually my next question to you. What do you think that government or any regulatory entities how they could facilitate this data gathering and encouraging to use the innovations such as artificial intelligence and machine learning. Like, from your experience, what would you need from the government or any regulatory institutes to do or think about to make it easier?
There are many things, but one specific would be for there to be a framework or an easy process for benefiting from sharing data, and for that to be a norm. For example, in breast cancer screening, which is a field I was involved in a while ago, there are organizations that try to pull together a few hospitals to share data. There are technologies that also enable that. That's kind of maybe worth mentioning, that on top of open sourcing and blockchain, another direction was called federated learning, where different entities share not data, but trained models on them in a way. So data is never leaving the entity, but only the information that is needed for the model to perform well. And we also have similar technologies right now on our phones, where we are sharing our personal data, but we are not sharing it with, let's say, some company, but only sharing what is necessary to improve models. So that's another technology that's useful. But coming back to your question, I think it's just difficult. Talking to a big pharma about data sharing is always challenging. If that were to become a norm, that could be interesting.
Richard, you have experience with big pharma in your past. Is it really difficult?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly difficult. And there's this belief that, which is true, that data is power, right? So the person who's sitting on the largest, most well-curated data sets is the one who's going to be able to bring things forward more quickly. So this creates a problem wherein big pharma doesn't want to share data because they want to own the data, and there's no economic incentive for them to do it. And the other aspect is, when we look at experiments that fail, and you're a publicly traded company, there is no value for you to say, we did this experiment, we put it into 50 patients, 4 of them died, and none of them got healthy, right? Your stock price goes down. That's a bad inflection point. So these data sets, which are super valuable, are never made publicly available. It's only the wins that make it into the public domain. And when it comes to how these models work, and both of my colleagues will probably support me on this, is that only looking at positive data is going to skew your models towards only looking at a certain type of outcome. And really what you want to be able to understand is what worked and what failed, because without that failure data set, you've got a biased perspective of how the probabilities should be, because you've only got the positive inflection data. So when we look at our data sets, things that we try and do is create data that is failed experiments. And when you talk with funding agencies, for example, and explain to them that there is intentionally designed experimentals that are going to fail, that need to be paid for, the likelihood of people investing a few $1 million into generating data that's negative data is really confusing for them, right? Because it's saying, well, you're going to create these experiments that you know are going to fail, provide the training data that allows you to get a more accurate representation of what biology looks like, right? And this is a place where government and funding agencies and regulatory agencies need to come to a meeting of the minds to overcome this chasm of death that the small and medium enterprises are going to experience, because there's this lack of funding that's going to get you from point A to point B, right? The money's not being invested. the government perspective to support when the larger VC companies are going to come in and say, yeah, we see the value of these crazy experiments that were done because they support the endpoint and the vision of where the drug is actually going to be in 2 or 3 years.
Yes. Our time is about to finish, so Chris, could you touch on, try to answer my question as well, and from your perspective, and we will slowly summarize.
Sure. So one interesting thing that happened throughout the COVID pandemic was actually that what became very popular among, we've been presented these multiple dashboards about how geographically on a daily basis, sometimes on an hourly basis, the situation is spreading, but that created a very important feeling that maybe you don't have control, but you do understand what's happening. So I believe for the drug discovery pipeline, if we think of it not as a pipeline, which is one way, but actually as a loop, because actually it is a continuous learning process. What is really important is to have take a good usage of visualization and presenting the data that we have from these gigabytes, terabytes into one single picture that explains everything. So that's really powerful portion and a standard that we are trying to encourage big pharma companies to keep as their standard. I would like to also maybe bring this thought maybe for the new panel is having what Richard said, that big pharma doesn't want to share the power that they do have. It actually has one good benefit, because we kind of trust those big companies for many reasons, but imagine how much bad stuff can happen if we just simply open source biological data to anybody. So now some bad guys can come to the stage, and instead of building drugs, they can start building some weapons. So it's not only about providing benefits, but it's also how we really make this secure. We are actually portion of the CyBERSEC conference. So like one problem solved brings 3 new problems to the table. So that's also interesting discussion. Maybe cryptography has something to deal with it, but yeah, that's 2 cents from me.
Well, thank you, Chris, for this summary and finishing and opening this topic, or leaving it open rather, to further discussion. Definitely, regulatory entities have a hard task to do, and EMA and the Polish government, I know that they're working on it, so hopefully we'll reveal their regulatory, their statements soon. Meanwhile, I would like to thank all of our panelists for being here and sharing their thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I hope this panel was beneficial to the audience as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.